We have to begin to realize what these emotions are. They are just the continuation or elaboration of that original equation: ego clinging, reactiveness. That equation in simply a more elaborate form. So in order to insert the spaciousness that is required, what we have to do is find a way to observe. So even when you're getting ready to kick the dog and throw the kid through the wall, when you're in that state, you know, I mean, technically speaking, it's very, very hard when you're in that state to do much about it, you know? Once you're there, you know, just wait for it to go away. I mean, that's all you can do. Once you're there, it's very difficult. But even if you can't suppress your emotion, and shouldn't, because that's not really the healthiest thing to do, even if you can't fake it and say it's something else, which so many of us do also. You know, we have anger and we say, oh no, it's over concern. Even if we're not able to do any of that, we, even in that roused, inflamed state, are able to observe ourselves. That is the unique capacity of human beings. Won't you use it? It's what distinguishes you from the rest. If there's anything that makes you special, that's it. The ability to put that spacious moment in there through observing the reaction. And even to the point where we say to ourselves, oh yeah, that's what I do. That's just like me. Yeah, that's just like me. I do that. And then maybe questioning oneself later on and going, well, I do that because I'm protecting my turf. I'm protecting my space. I'm not wanting to change anything. I'm wanting to be powerful and right. So I need to put everybody else down. Whatever it is, simply observe. Just observe. And you'll find out that if you do that consistently, deliberately, honestly, and truly, and deeply as you can, that after a while, and it doesn't come immediately, so please don't look for immediate results necessarily, but after a while, you will find yourself, there'll be a spacious moment, just a little moment between you and your reaction. And eventually, in your practice, by practicing Dharma, by using generation and completion stage methods, you will be able to recognize in that spaciousness, you can begin to recognize the emptiness of both the ego and that which affects it. But it takes a combination of things. Not only the ability to practice Dharma the way that our teachers teach us in generating oneself as a deity and practicing completion stage practice. It also takes this deliberate walking, waking mindfulness. This is part of the path. Lamas have taught, bodhisattvas have taught time and time again that one's practice must be part of one's life. That it has to be an ongoing thing, that you can't separate it from whatever else it is that you do. That literally the opportunity to practice exists in our lives. And so therefore, to only utilize sit down time and completely separate that from the rest of our lives without any effort toward recognition or mindfulness is really pretty useless. It's like trying to drive down the street with no air in your tires. You're not going to get that far. This mindfulness, this ongoing thing, like anything else, any habitual tendency, can be a little bit painful or tight at first. You know, that happens. But you know that, and you've broken through things like that before when they were important to you. For those of you maybe that have quit smoking, let's say. All right, you smoked for a while and that was really comfortable, and when you first quit smoking, that was a raw and painful thing, but you pushed through it because you knew that establishing the habit pattern was going to be the way to go. That was the only way to get to that goal. Why don't we think the same way about our practice? Why do we think that we just have to wait for the glory? With exercise, let's say, you know, if you decide you're going to exercise, you have a goal. You don't want to be a blob anymore. So that's your goal, and you're fervent about it. When you first exercise, you're going to hurt. It's going to ache. If you're really committed and you're really not into being a blob, you're going to take 2 Tylenol and you're going to continue. You're going to push through it. Why can't we push through our own habitual tendencies? Why can't we push through into some kind of ritual of recognition? If we can ritualize working out, if we can ritualize stop smoking, if we can ritualize crossing the street safely, if we can ritualize occupational training, my God, why can't we do that? Ritualize the state of recognition so that we make it part and practice of our walking, waking lives. We trained to become whatever we are now. Are you a doctor? Are you a nurse? Well, you trained for that. Wasn't it hard when you first started taking in all that information? Sure it was. Are you a professional in any way? You trained for that. It wasn't hard when you made those new habits, but you saw a goal and you had to get there. Because everything in you told you you're supposed to be successful at that. Why won't we accept this responsibility in our practice? Because that's what it takes. It takes really accepting that responsibility in our practice. If you want to play guitar, your fingers are going to hurt for a while. You've got to build calluses. But ordinary human beings, perfectly ordinary human beings, can do that. Because they observe the equation, they can see that if they want to get there, they have to go through this uncomfortable zone of practice. Why can't we do that in our practice, in our spiritual practice? Why is it up to our teacher to push us through to realization? Why do we hang around like limp practitioners and go, well, after I do this practice, what practice should I do after that? Without really ever trying in the least little way to have any recognition of phenomena, any recognition whatsoever of the nature of phenomena, of the nature of reality. We're perfectly able to do this. We do this in other areas of our lives. Why is this so hard? Once again, we have to overcome that childish, immature part of us that we have preserved. Remember I told you, once you get a concept in your mind, it stays there. Never changes. So literally, when you were knee-high to a grasshopper, and you caught on to the fact that when you got caught, it was very, very bad, that idea has never changed. We literally, once that idea is there, it's in you. You have that idea. Why go back and challenge it? You know it's true. When you get caught, it's trouble, right? So why reconfigure it? Well, because it isn't true. You're not only in trouble when you get caught. You're in trouble when you're in a state of non-recognition. You're in trouble when you're asleep, spiritually speaking. So why are we thinking in that same childish way? Because it is also our nature, and we have to observe this about ourselves, that we're incredibly lazy in certain ways. We like to keep really busy if it's getting us a goal, because we want that. But when it comes to backtracking and reevaluating an old conceptual scenario, like it's only trouble when you get caught, we're not going to do that unless we are pushed to do it. We're not going to do that because we already did it. Why do it again? That's another thing about ourselves that is detrimental and very difficult. But I'm telling you that in order to practice effectively, you must go back and challenge all things samsaric, all conceptual proliferation. That what we have to do is to go back and reevaluate. Instead of going through the rest of our lives in this childlike way. And you know how childlike we are about this. We just don't want to get caught. We don't want to get in trouble. We don't want people to think bad of us. So we work very hard at this. Instead of staying in that childish place, which only reinforces self-nature to be inherently real, only reinforces ego-cherishing and ego-clinging and the division between self and other. Why not go back and challenge appearances? Why not go back and reevaluate and ask yourself, what is the nature of suffering? Where does the suffering come from? Does it come from getting caught? Like, for instance, if you are gifted with that ability to impress people with how cool you are, how attractive, how well thought, how well considered you are, how honest and just generally wonderful you are. If you have that ability to convince people of that, usually it's about maybe 10 minutes, 15 minutes before the real you shows up. But anyway, if you have that ability, and yet within your mind, you're basically, well, a schmuck. You're basically constantly in judgment of others, constantly uncaring about others, constantly in a state of non-recognition. You're constantly fearful, you're kind of angry, you're not competitive. There's just general, your average, ordinary, mid-grade schmuckness on the inside, but on the outside it's not visible. You have the greatest obstacle of all. I am so sorry for you. I mean, heartfelt sorry. And I'll do anything I can to help you work through that. But it's not going to work unless you work through it with me. It's much easier to be a student if you're somebody like a recovering alcoholic. People have seen you vomit. You know, you have gotten to the bottom and it was nasty and dirty and there was no way you could avoid it. There was no way you could avoid it. I have more hope for the practitioner that one day decided to practice because they woke up in a pool of their own vomit than I do the practitioner that wants to practice because they want to be a Buddhist. You think about that. To come to the point where you really deal with yourself, and with the appearances that you are putting forth, and discriminate between that. And just faking your way through. This is really, it's quite a different level of depth, isn't it? Logically, you have to ask yourself, remaining in a state of non-recognition, acting outwardly as though you have some answers going, what do you think the result will be? Why wait for me to tell you? What do you think the result will be? Assuming that the seed and the fruit are the same, that seed produces the appropriate fruit and not a different kind of fruit. What do you think is going to happen? Do you think your life will have less suffering in it or more? So much more. So much more. But to be in a state where you've seen that there is some flaw here, that there's something wrong here, there is a kind of self-honesty that you have attained, such as in the case of maybe the recovering alcoholic. And you come to the point where you say, well, anywhere I go from here is up. You know? I mean, and that is a very valuable point, because at that point, you're not faking it. You're not in a place where you're saying, oh, if I act this way, then I'll be this way. Having fallen so far to where you've bottomed out and really, in a sense, recognized the faults of samsara, when you begin to engage mindfulness, it won't be an external acting. It will be more of an internal engagement or an internal awareness. So it's that kind of thoughtfulness, that kind of mindfulness, that kind of recognition that should be, must be part of our practice. If we had been born in a culture where spiritual progression, spiritual evolvement, where realization was not only valued, but eventually it is expected, we wouldn't have to be told this. In the same way that in a materialistic society, we don't have to be told that you have to train for your profession. We would automatically, by reading these texts, understand that it is pointless to read the prayers, even if you read them so good and you are so cool when you read them. It is pointless to read these prayers if you have no understanding of their meaning, or if you are insincere about this recitation. There's just no point. To realize that the point is to actually awaken, to move into a state of recognition, one would practice differently than if one's understanding was you had to do a certain amount of practice in order to be a really cool guy, or in order to be successful at Buddhism. Do you see the difference? One is about mind training, and the other is about samsara. Training the mind is a very personal, very intimate, very private thing. Because there is nobody that can train our minds better than we can. No one can know the ins and outs of how we think better than we can. And so that responsibility as well as that power lies in our hands. Therefore, the most important aspect of one's practice is to practice recognition of the nature of phenomena, of the emptiness of all it is, to practice recognition of cause and effect relationships, to practice recognition of the faults of samsara, to practice recognition of the difference between what is ordinary and what is the miraculous activity of the Buddhas. To practice this kind of recognition is the point. And it's included in the book practices that we do. Because we're trained as materialists, we don't get that. But that is as much our practice as reading these prayers is, more so. Because if you were to practice a state of recognition without having a book, let's say you were a prisoner and you couldn't get your books, you could still practice a state of recognition. You could still learn to practice the view. You could still examine your habitual tendencies. You can still reorient your intentions and your understandings. There's so much that you can do. So as we've been talking today about mindfulness, including the class that we had last night. Mindfulness, yes. Just kidding. Listen, I'm only teasing him because I am the queen of late. So in talking about mindfulness, perhaps you've noticed that we mentioned mindfulness in regarding our practice of Guru Yoga, mindfulness in recognizing what is extraordinary, what is precious, what is the result of the Buddha's miraculous intention, what is the result of the mind of enlightenment. We've talked about, so in that sense, we've learned how to recognize what is precious and what is an object of refuge. So we've learned about practicing mindfulness in that way. You might notice, and also we're talking about practicing mindfulness in bodhicitta, or in the practice of compassion. We talked about that. You might notice that we're following some of the main divisions of your ngundro, or preliminary practice. And that's exactly what I meant to do. So continuing on in that direction, I'd like to talk about mindfulness in offering practices. As you know, when you do your preliminary practice, you at some point accumulate 100,000 repetitions of mandala offerings. And that's fairly elaborate practice, and you sit down and you work with the mandala set, and you make the mounds, and you have all this visualization. So is that where your offering practice stops? Is that where, do you accumulate your mandala practice, or do you make your offerings to the deities and then walk away from your practice and not be involved in your practice anymore? No, of course not. In order to practice truly and more deeply, what we have to do is we have to remain mindful of the practice constantly. Remember that we are trying to antidote ego clinging. We're trying to antidote the belief in self-nature as being inherently real. We are trying to antidote the desire, the hope, the fear that results from that identification of self-nature as being inherently real and other as being separate. Remember that that's the point of what we're doing. So if we were to practice offering, if we were to practice accumulating, let's say, mandala offerings, or to make offerings at a temple, and then have that practice end and no longer be a part of our lives, we wouldn't be applying that antidote very well. At least not as well as we might. So how would it be possible for us to avoid this ego clinging? How would it be possible to avoid simply reinforcing samsara's unfortunate message when we go around and simply enjoy ourselves? Remember what I was telling you, that it is good, it is a worthy thing to do, to notice when you perceive something like a house or a tree or a flower, how automatic your reaction and response to that is. How absolutely you react by, you respond by reacting. How is this flower going to affect me? This flower, this tree, how is it going to be meaningful if it doesn't affect me? That's its meaning, it affects me. And so we think like that. The practice that I'm suggesting is something that you can do without ever sitting down and meditating. So those of you that have no time, this is a great practice. Those of you that are convinced that you have very little time to practice, this is a good thing. When we're walking about doing anything, no matter what it is, we see appearances. Images come to us. They are sometimes very favorable, sometimes very beautiful, sometimes wonderful, and we enjoy them, and sometimes not. When we enjoy them by clinging, by taking that experience in a sense and holding on to it, grabbing it. We're grasping that experience. That tree is only relevant because I see it. Out of sight, out of mind. When the tree is out of my sight, it no longer exists. So we think like that. My suggestion is that rather than just do your practice when you're sitting down, why not be mindful constantly, to where when you see the appearance of any phenomena, when you see any kind of beautiful thing, like for instance when you look outside and you see how lovely it is out there, how gorgeous it is, the trees and the flowers and the sweetness of the air and all that stuff, how can you not let that beauty simply reinforce our clinging to ego, that clinging to identity? One good way to do that is to develop an automatic habit. And again, those habits start small and they end up big. We start at the beginning and we simply increase. Develop the habit of offering everything that you see. You think, huh? How can I offer it if it's not mine? No, that's not the point. Whether it's yours or not, your senses will grab it as yours. You will react to it. You will respond to it. You will judge it. And so it becomes, in a way, your thing. You collect it. When you see something, you collect it and you hold on to it. And the experience is what you take away. We take away the experience. Maybe we can't take away the tree, but that doesn't mean anything because we've taken away our experience of the tree. It's become ours. And it reinforces that delusion. Instead of doing that, isn't it possible, upon seeing something beautiful, upon taking a walk, having a good feeling, accomplishing something wonderful, seeing beautiful things, having meaningful relationships with other people, any kind of enjoyment, any kind of pleasure that is part of your life can be offered. It can be thought of in a different way. For instance, if we were to walk down the street and see a field of flowers, if we didn't know about Buddhism, if we didn't hear any of these teachings about the Dharma, then maybe we might pick some of the flowers, we might think, oh, that's a meaningful experience because I feel good about it. I'm really happy with that. So that's why these flowers become meaningful, is because they've affected you in a certain way. And it continues the delusion. Having heard about Dharma, we have the option, when we see and enjoy a whole field of flowers, that we can visualize in a very simple way, instead of that automatic clinging to this image and trying to take it with us, trying to make it part of us. Instead of that, there can be an instant habit that we form of offering this to all the Buddhas. I love these fields. These field of flowers is so wonderful. I love it so much. And my automatic habit can be, if we work on it, instead of clinging to it in some subtle way, offer it to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Any good taste, for instance, a good flavor in your mouth. A lot of times when we have a pleasurable experience like good food or good taste, you may notice that ultimately it's not so good. The food turns into, well, you know what it turns into. Doo-doo. And still, the experience does us no good, because when we were tasting it, we were clinging to it. That's mine. You see? I'm tasting it. It's in my taste buds. It's that relationship between my taste buds and that food that's really important. And so we're stuck in that delusion. We're stuck in that dream. Supposing we were able to instead develop the habit of, when we eat something, practicing as well by automatically offering the flavor and the taste of that to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. It's like you're not grabbing onto it, you're not making it your experience, you're not reinforcing that dynamic of self and other. But rather, when you taste, just simply offering it. And you can learn to do it so quickly. I mean, when you first start, it sometimes it's a little bit cumbersome. Because, you know, you take a bite of food, you go, okay, I offer this to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. Take another bite of food, offer this to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. At first it may seem a little dry and uncomfortable, but there's an inner posture that we can develop that's an automatic response, as automatic as deciding whether or not you like that taste. But as the taste hits you, you immediately, the experience of that can be just offering it to the Buddhas and Bodhisattvas. It can be so immediate that no words are required. You've developed this habit of making this constant offering. As parents, when we bond with our children and hold our children and have that wonderful, pleasurable experience of cuddling our kids and feeling wonderful, you know, as ordinary human beings, we think, oh, this is my child. This is the extension of my ego. I made that. I made an egg, and look what happened. So we have a very great pride about that, and our family becomes like an extension of our ego, an extension of what we call ourselves. So what if we were to take an alternative tactic? What if we were able to, as we hold our beloved children, as we feel that feeling, rather than putting another star in the crown, you know, and thinking, oh yeah, this is my kid and I'm holding her now, instead of thinking that feeling, even the connection, the incredible, powerful connection between mother and child, that too can be offered to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. And when you offer something to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, it's not as though it disappears. It's not as though once you offer that feeling of loving your child to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, even that, it doesn't mean that the feeling disappears and suddenly you don't love your kid anymore. It's not like that. Anything that we offer really in some magical way becomes multiplied, becomes even more than it originally could have been. In not using what we see with our five senses as a way to practice more self-absorption, by using what we see in the five senses instead as a way to accomplish some kind of recognition. This is a very powerful practice and a very excellent adornment for the sit-down practice that we do. Sometimes when we begin to make these offerings, we think maybe it's not so good to offer something that's not yours. But that's because we're materialists and we have this idea of ownership. We really don't understand how things are. We're kind of sick and deluded with this idea of the self being the center of all experience. So that being the case, when we offer a tree or a beautiful thing, a field of flowers that isn't ours, or, and here's another thing that you can do, to even offer an experience that you have with someone else that's wonderful and pleasurable to you, or to see a friend of yours has not one, not two, but 3 cars. For you to offer those cars to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas in your mind, just like see them offered to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas, is that illegal because you don't own them? Of course not. The idea isn't about ownership. It isn't about defining that yet again. It's about allowing these 5 senses to participate in recognition in some way, even if it's only in a small way. To offer anything that one sees, any image that is formulated in the eyes, any sound, the sound of the beloved's voice, maybe your beloved friend, your beloved spouse or child, to the sound of that voice that is so comforting and so wonderful to us. That very sound can be offered. That when it meets your ears, rather than owning it and saying, this is about me and my children, or me and my spouse, or me and my stuff. Rather than that, instead, making that kind of ongoing process of offering. In a very real sense, you're not so much offering the object as you are offering your response to the object. You're allowing your senses, your thoughts, your sensibilities to work in a different way than they had worked before. So then you can feel free. You can offer someone else's money. You can do anything you want to in that way. As long as you are truly sincere and it's done in a profound way. If you as a practitioner, remember we're talking about thinking about the faults of cyclic existence, we're talking about practicing that kind of renunciation because we have seen the faults of cyclic existence. Perhaps you may meet somebody really rich and you may notice, because of the contemplating you've been doing, because of the practicing that you've been doing, that those people are so connected to their money that there is some real clinging going on there. And maybe you notice that that person is all about their money. And maybe to you, in your mind, because you've practiced recognition, you can see that this is a non-virtue. You can see that this is not making that person happy. that literally the money has no power to make that person happy. And so, knowing that in your own practice, you can visualize that money and offer it to the Buddhas and the Bodhisattvas. What good does it do? Does the money disappear out of the banks? No. Perhaps there is some small blessing. Perhaps more importantly, you, by making such an offering, by thinking that way, can begin to differentiate, to distinguish between clinging and some form of recognition that there is something more precious than our egos. So maybe it's a tiny step, maybe it's a baby step, but many of those baby steps make for big movements. Cultivate the habit of constantly offering everything that you see, all pleasure. And even when we come into a place in our life where it's very uncomfortable, where there's some hardship, and perhaps we survive that hardship, perhaps we overcome that hardship, that very event can also be offered and considered. That event can be considered practice. That event can be considered a manifestation of an opportunity to have made offerings, to have been more mindful, to have been in a better state of recognition. Then that very difficulty that you just survived becomes a form of practice. It becomes sacred. For Westerners, our biggest problem is that lack of a deeper understanding of how to practice. We still think, once again, that you go to church on Sunday and you practice on Sunday. And you do your religious thing on Sunday and maybe on the other holidays. We still have that division in our mind. We are deeply materialistic people. And that is the worst horrible delusion that we're stuck in, is that inability to recognize any distinction because of our material outlook. Practicing in this way gives us the opportunity to develop constant mindfulness, constant purification of the mind, constantly working the mind, constantly creating habitual tendencies. It's perfect for Westerners to practice this way in addition to their sit-down practice, because we have such limited time to sit down, and because we're taught that when you're sitting down, you're being lazy. And so our whole commitment is to be busy all the time. So one way to begin to counteract that, one way to begin to work with that, is to practice in that way that we are constantly making offerings. Another aspect of our Lindro practice is purification, the prayers to Vajrasattva, right? You all are familiar with that? Most of you are. So this purification and confessional practice, how good is this? How would this be if we were to sit here for maybe an hour and practice some Vajrasattva and accumulate the mantra, then we put our books aside and it's over. That's it. I confessed. I confessed. I said all the prayers, the short ones and the long ones. Short confession, long confession. Remember, if you practice like that, you never have to revisit it again. It's a lazy, cop-out way to practice. Instead, we should think, I'm deeply involved in the process of purification and confession, and it does not stop at the end of our practice. There are so many ways to practice that kind of purification. By being mindful, by making offerings in the way that I've described, by moving into a state of better recognition about what is precious and what is ordinary. Moving into the state of recognition of the nature of all phenomena. Automatically, one is constantly purifying the senses. Constantly purifying our intention, which is the thing that needs purifying even more than anything else, is our intention. If we practice in that way as we're walking around, it complements any confessional prayers that we make, because in most of the confessional prayers we talk about, if you really read the meaning of the prayers and the content of the prayers, there is this talk about broken samaya in the confessional prayers. Nobody really knows what that means. Does that mean you didn't do your mantra today? Well, maybe on one level it means that, but on a deeper level, it is the state of non-recognition. So everything that we do as we continually make offerings, as we continually give rise to a more, to a deeper recognition, then constantly the five senses are being purified. The habit that I'm suggesting you develop will antidote the automatic reaction that is so natural for us, so habitual. And remember, we can insert this way of thinking, this way of perceiving, this way of practicing, because we are human. Now, I really like animals. I have 20 birds, 2 dogs. My daughter has a cat. I really like animals. But one thing I've noticed about animals, even if they're trainable and very smart, is that they cannot change, alter in any way the way that they perceive their environment. They can't do that. The dog can't say, wait a minute. Before I lift that leg, let's think about the nature of that fire hydrant. The dog is not capable of this. You are. You are. That is the great blessing of being a human being, one of the great blessings of being a human being. And yet the habits that we cultivate are the habits that you don't even have to be a human being to do. That habit of automatically reacting, not taking oneself in hand, not creating any kind of space or moment where we can recognize the nature of reality, not making any offerings, that just automatic moving through life like an automaton, like a robot. We cultivate that, yet that's the one thing that humans can be really good at. They can develop a little bit of space in their minds to antidote that constant clinging and reactivity. And yet we're all about collecting things. Well, you know, crows collect things, and we're all about having relationships. Well, even animals can bond for life. And we're all about having children. Well, dogs and cats do that too. Isn't it wonderful that here in Dharma practice, if we choose to, if we practice sincerely, we can do that which only humans can do. How amazing. In our Ngundro practice as well, we have the practice of offering oneself of generosity. It's called the practice of chud. It's not actually one of the accumulations, but you've noticed that it's in your Ngundro book. That practice of chud is another one that can very easily be practiced constantly. The practice of chud is based on eliminating ego clinging through transforming oneself into that which is beneficial to all sentient beings and offering oneself. In chud, there is actually a visualization where you see all your different elements separated into piles, like there's skin and there's bones and there's muscles and there's fat and there's eyeballs and there's stuff like that. And all of that stuff is all put in little piles, and then you cook it all up and then you offer it up to the Buddhas. And you think, well, that's kind of interesting little practice there, isn't it? Whoa, dude. Alrighty then. But just remember that this is meant to antidote our ego clinging, because as we walk through our lives, we are all about what can you do for me? And what do I want? Remember, as we're walking through our lives as ordinary sentient beings, our mantra is gimme, 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 gimme. I want, I want, I want, I want. So this kind of practice is meant to antidote that.
Now